And now, let me show in a figure how far our nature is unenlightened or enlightened. Behold, says Socrates in Book 7 of Plato's Republic, behold, human beings living in an underground den, which has a mouth open towards the light, and reaching all along the den, here they have been from their childhood, and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move, and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning round their heads. Above and behind them a fire is blazing at a distance, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised way, and you will see, if you look, a low wall built along that way, like the screen from which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show their puppets. And do you see, Socrates says, men passing along the wall, carrying all sorts of vessels and statues and figures of animals made of wood and stone and various materials, which appear over the wall. Some of them are talking, others silent. These men are like ourselves, Socrates says, and they see only their own shadows, or the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. And the objects which are being carried in a like manner, they see only the shadows. Suppose further, says Socrates, that the prison had an echo which came from the other side. Would the prisoners not fancy, when one of the passers-by spoke, that the voice they heard came in fact from the passing shadow? To them, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of images. And now look again and see what will naturally follow if the prisoners are released and disabused of their error. At first, when any of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck around and walk and look towards the light, he will suffer sharp pains, the glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities of which his former state he had seen only the shadows. And then conceive someone saying to him that what he saw before was a mere illusion, but that now, when he is approaching nearer to being, and his eye is turned towards more real existence, he has a clearer vision. What will be his reply? And you may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be perplexed? Will he not fancy that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than the new objects which are now shown to him? And if he is compelled to look straight at the light, will he not have a pain in his eyes, which will make him turn away to take refuge in the objects of vision which he can see, and which he will conceive to be in reality clearer than the things which are now being shown to him? Suppose, once more, that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent, and held fast until he is forced into the presence of the sun itself. Is he not likely to be pained and irritated? And when he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all of what are now called realities. He will be required to grow accustomed to the sight of the upper world. At first he will see the shadows best, next the reflections of men and other objects in the water, and then the objects themselves. Then he will gaze upon the light of the moon and the stars and the spangled heaven, and he will see the sky and the stars by night better than the sun, or the light of the sun by day. Last of all, he will be able to see the sun itself, and not mere reflections of the sun and the water, but he will see the sun in its own proper place, and not in another, and he will contemplate the sun as it is. He will then proceed to argue that that the sun is what gives season to the years, and is the guardian of all that which is in the visible world, and in a certain way the cause of all things which he and his fellows have been accustomed to behold. And when he remembered his old habitation and the wisdom of the den and his fellow prisoners, do you not suppose that he would felicitate himself on the change and pity them? And if they were in the habit of conferring honors among themselves on those who were quickest to observe the passing shadows and to remark which of them went before and which followed after and which were together, and who were therefore best able to draw conclusions as to the future, do you think that he would care for such honors, this man who had escaped the prison? Or would he envy the possessors of these prisoners of the cave? Would he not say, like Homer, better to be a poor servant of a poor master, and to endure anything rather than think as they do and live after their manner? Imagine once more, Socrates continues, I said, such a one coming suddenly out of the sun to be replaced in his old situation. Would he not be certain to have his eyes full of darkness, the eyes readjusting to the dark after having become freshly accustomed to the light? And if there were a contest, and he had to compete in measuring the shadows with the prisoners who had never moved out of the den, while his sight was still weak, and before his eyes had become steady again. Would he not be ridiculous? Men would say of him that he went up, and that up he went, and down he came without eyes, and that it was better not even to think of ascending, and if anyone tried to loose another, and lead him up to the light, let them only catch the offender, and they would put him to death. This is Plato's famous parable of the cave from Book 7 of the Republic. By way of something of a recap from the first lecture, in which I presented the parable of the blind man and the elephant, we can just turn to a parable like this and think, what does it really mean to grasp a parable, to understand a parable, to comprehend it? Clearly it's more, again, than just having understood each word, right? And it's more than having read it. There's something beyond mere assemblage or gathering of the facts and the information. We somehow have to be able to, well, we're charged with making meaning of those facts, and this is a way of approaching critical thinking. So it's not merely gathering data or gathering facts, but it's in some way beginning to perceive the meaning of those facts, and in some ways this is akin to understanding why those facts were gathered in the first place. If we consider the story of the parable of the cave, it's clear that there was a reason that Plato put together these images and created this story. There was a cause for the story that we're reading as an effect. If we wish to grasp the meaning of the parable of the cave, this will entail in some way ourselves ascending to grasp that same cause that Plato himself, that motivated Plato himself to even write this parable. And so again, facts by themselves, or knowledge, information by itself, while it's necessary for critical thinking, it's not sufficient. And I hope that through the presentation of these two parables, that this can become increasingly clear. Let's try to reflect on the parable of the cave now, and see if we can draw some meaning out of it. Any meaning that we draw from it, this doesn't, by arriving at a certain meaning or grasping something, coming to understand something from this parable, this doesn't mean that we've exhausted what it can mean, but the experience, the sort of experience of apprehension or the aha moment, that itself is proof. It's kind of self-evident that we have indeed come to some kind of insight that before this was lacking for us. And so if we reflect on the parable of the cave, the first thing to really consider is that Plato is presenting it as a parable or an allegory, not just a story. The difference is that in the parable or the allegory, the purpose of the tale is explicitly to set up a sort of parallel or a metaphorical situation. In other words, one thing represents another thing. And Socrates basically gives us the cipher for this right at the very beginning when he says, these prisoners that I'm about to tell you, I'm on the point of telling you about these prisoners. But he says, before he even begins, he says, these are not like those people or other people. These are not people that we're talking about. This is us. And so the kind of the keyhole to understand this parable is to see it as not a description of some hypothetical situation, right, in a cave somewhere, but no, the cave representative of our ordinary way of thinking. And this might be somewhat of a shocking or maybe even controversial thought that we would be likened to prisoners in a cave, and maybe we will find that to be true. But at the same time, we have to be willing to entertain the fact that in some way we are indeed so limited as those prisoners that Plato describes. The reason I say we have to be willing to entertain it is because if we consider the prisoners that basically bind themselves and ensure that they will never escape the cave, we realize that what binds the prisoners to the cave is their refusal to believe that they are in fact in a cave. And so it's like the first condition of escaping the cave is to acknowledge that we're already in the cave, that we're in the cave itself. To be in denial about being in a cave, this basically ensures that a person will never escape it. And I think that's one reason that this parable is so timeless and so expressive. It's because it captures that this kind of the source and origin of knowledge, which is in some way an appreciation or a sort of acceptance of the lack of knowledge. And so in some way it's like the acceptance of ignorance is the soil from which the garden of knowledge can flourish. But we have to tend that soil, the soil of again unknowing, ignorance, but fertile ignorance that we're willing to tend, and we're also willing to sow seeds that can become knowledge. And so again, just to emphasize, we in the parable of the cave we have an illustration of what can happen with a refusal to accept the limitations to our knowledge, to believe that we in some way possess all the knowledge that there is to know. Again, this is what ensures that the prisoners in the cave will never escape. And so, just as a kind of invitation for us to reflect, if we think that we're outside of the cave, if we think we've already escaped the cave, that means we're probably still in the cave. And so, not only is, among many other things, Plato's parable of the cave can also serve as a sort of almost like a call for us to become more awake and more energetic in our thinking, trying to understand in ways that maybe we haven't been bothered before. And so again, though, the condition for this is that we have to be willing to see this story not as a story happening somewhere else, but rather a description of something that's perfectly immediate to our own lives. And that's something that we can consider again, but also in connection with the parable of the blind man and the elephant. At the end of the last lecture, I posed the question as just a sort of invitation to think further. The question of what are these parables? They're presenting images to us. The parable of the cave obviously is presenting an image of a cavern, fire, shadows, and then the ascent and the escape from the cavern. The blind man and the elephant is obviously presenting an image of a megafauna with people touching it, feeling various aspects. Those images, though, they're meant to represent something. And a question for us is, what is the relationship between what the images represent and the images themselves? Right? So what is the elephant? What is the cave? What are they, as a whole, what are these stories trying to give pictorial form to? They're almost giving body to something. And one way we can think about this is to imagine, to just reflect on the fact that our own understanding, our own cognitive and intellectual and mental and spiritual processes, they are invisible to us. In some way, they are themselves, we don't see them, they don't have a shape. They are invisible to us, while at the same time being the condition by which everything else is visible. By that I mean we can't understand, we can't see anything that we don't understand, perceive, even in some very rudimentary level. And so it's like these mental or intellectual capacities that allow us to that make the world intelligible to us. These themselves don't have a shape. This is to sort of invoke an example that Plato actually gives on another occasion. I believe it's in the Meno dialogue. He talks about the fact of roundness, for example, roundness or circularity is not a circle, right? Circularity is like the quality or the condition of having individual circles. But so the idea is like circularity itself or roundness itself does not have a shape. So in the same way, apprehension or understanding or cognition or intellection, those things themselves, they're invisible. They don't have a shape. In some way, these parables are attempting to give a sort of, again, a metaphorical shape to them. And by doing that, it allows us to grasp them in a different way than if we're merely trying to work with concepts. The concepts can become quite abstract, and it can become difficult to navigate and negotiate the different concepts. Once they're given a sort of mythological or pictorial, imaginal form, then suddenly we feel much more, they're much more tangible, and we can work with them and see them in a different way. So one way to understand both the parable of the cave and the blind man and the elephant is that in some way they are presenting before us, sort of they're confronting us or setting before us images of what's actually going on inside of us. And by inside, I don't mean inside the boundaries of our skin, but I mean sort of inside of our minds, which are not spatial objects. So again, I don't mean either inside of our heads exactly. I mean, or inside of our brains necessarily. I mean inside of our minds, which a mind is not necessarily a spatial thing. It's like you can't exactly draw boundaries on your mind the way you could draw boundaries on your brain, for example. And so they're different things. These parables, though, they're trying to give us pictures of, and again, representative pictures of what is happening in our minds when we understand something. Over future lectures and over the weeks to follow, we can continue to explore just the various implications of what this might entail, and specifically comparing the parable of the cave to the blind man and the elephant. There are important parallels and similarities, and then also important distinctions. And I think together they form a more comprehensive picture. This maybe goes without saying, but the two together form a more comprehensive picture of what we're after here, which is to kind of understand our own thinking, to become critical about our own thinking and not just naive about it. You can see in some way the parable of the elephant, the blind man and the elephant, they each approach the elephant from a different side. Similarly with these two parables, in some way each parable is like a blind man trying to approach this this ultimate object of our course, which is to understand thinking itself, right? And then maybe in the service of how we can do better with it. We can think a little bit more about the specific parable, Plato's parable of the cave, and try to understand what sort of knowledge is depicted by the characters in the bottom of the cave, and how that kind of knowledge compares to the knowledge that is the knowledge that the first prisoner to be liberated, the knowledge that he attains when he suddenly turns around and in some way perceives the objects that are first casting shadows in the back of the cave. I suggested this in the last lecture, and here's I think this is a good opportunity to explore the implications of it a little bit. The prisoners in the bottom of the cave are perceiving shadows on the wall. These shadows are the effects of something. The prisoners on the bottom of the cave are they're ignorant as to the causes of those effects. In other words, they take the shadows themselves to be sort of self-explanatory or independently existing. They don't recognize those shadows to be, in fact, effects from prior causes. Something happens with this turning about intellectual conversion, right? When the figure or the character is released from the bottom of the cave, and he turns about and he suddenly beholds the figures that are casting shadows in the bottom of the cave. This represents again, a turning about and a recognition of not only the effects but also the causes of those effects. And in principle, this is a more complete knowledge. It's a more comprehensive knowledge. It's a more perfect knowledge, yeah? Because only it's like only through the perception of the cause has a person really understood the nature of the effect itself. To assume to just naively believe that the effect contains its own explanation, that's a mistake, right? That's an error. And so when the character turns about and perceives the objects that are casting those shadows, he's again attained a more comprehensive knowledge. Then clearly the ascent out of the cave and every point in the story represents a sort of a further higher and higher gradient of the sort of perfection in knowledge. And in this parable, the sun stands in as a representative of sort of perfect truth. Or maybe we could even think of it as, well, what the elephant is to the parable of the blind man and the elephant, the sun is to Plato's parable of the cave. And what I mean by that is somehow the truth with a capital T. And this might seem like kind of a stretch even within the parable of the cave, but then even moreover, trying to compare the two, it might seem like a stretch. But I think I can explain why it's appropriate to compare those two things. Because you might think, well, the sun is not necessarily the causes of the shadows in the bottom of the cave. You might say the sun, well, the sun is causes the visibility of things outside of the cave, but what is inside of the cave is being illuminated by fire, not by the sun. That's partly true, but I think again, if we think and try to enter into it in a more comprehensive way, we will see that in a very similar and an analogous way to the way that the shadows themselves are effects and not causes, and so we don't really understand the shadows unless we've understood what's causing them. And similarly, if we think about just fire and suppose it's a wood burning, just a moment's reflection will reveal to us that wood doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? It's rather the process of months and years of photosynthesis on the behalf of flora and different trees. And these trees are literally weaving sunlight into matter. And that same sunlight as energy is then, if you light something on fire, it's released. So the light is sort of enchanted in the carbon bonds in wood and then released again when you kindle something and set it aflame. And so in some way it's, even within the parable, there's a sort of inner consistency or inner logic. The fire is in fact, the sun is in fact the cause of the fire in the cave, and because again, no fire could burn without the wood, which is again almost, it's not so much of a stretch to say it's a condensation of sunlight, plant matter, and so so again there is an internal consistency within the parable. Ascending outside of the cave, it's clear that as the sunlight is to the eye, as the sunlight is to sight, is probably a better way to say it. The sunlight is the cause or the condition of sight. Like if we took away light, we could have no sight. Yeah, and so those two things go together as I'm saying cause, but I'm not distinguishing cause from condition. In other words, a condition is something that has to be in place before the next thing can happen. Well, so light has to be in place before sight can happen. And so in the parable of the cave, then, if we want to say, what is it representing? I've set up these two. So here we have the two parables, but then parables themselves are kind of they're supposed to operate as a in parallel or as a metaphor relative to something in what we think of as real life that those parables are imitating or representing. If we then try to think, okay, what does the sun in Plato's parable of the cave, what is it representing in terms of and what I suggested are kind of cognitive or intellectual processes? We can think of, and to set up an analogy, the sun is to sight. So in other words, it's the condition for sight. There could be no sight except for the sun. Analogously, so by analogy to our daily lives, what we're living in every day, as the sun is to sight, so for Plato, this idea of the truth, or he calls it the good, but we can also think of it as the principle that of realness, of being, of truth. Plato calls it the good. Just as the sun is to sight, so it's the condition for recognizing things for what they are through our eyes. So the good, or the truth, is as the sun is to sight, so is the truth, or the good, to insight. It's like we can't conceive or have a sort of we can't understand something that's not true, right? And so the truth, it's somehow when we grasp something by means of our understanding. What Plato is suggesting here is that it's because we are in some ways we are allowing our minds to be illuminated by the truth of things. And I think it's safe to say that this is not how we ordinarily think of our own cognitive processes, our own intellectual processes, and that's fair. That's a fair comment to make. But at the same time, I think it's also fair to say we don't think of them altogether that often. And so here we have Plato's parable of the cave together with the parable of the blind man and the elephant. They're both offering us invitations of new ways to think about our own process of sense making in the world. And that's probably a good place to stop. But I will just maybe leave us with this final thought, which is, we might think, well, reflecting on our own cognitive processes, our own intellectual processes, reflecting on how we make sense of things, that might be something that we do in our free time, but it's sort of a leisure activity. Like it's something that doesn't, it's a little bit impractical. Maybe it's like abstract or philosophical. But and then there's real life on the other side. And so we have this kind of reflection, philosophical reflection on the one hand, and then we have the rest of our lives on the other hand. And just as a kind of parting thought, I would like to suggest that that kind of division is actually it's exactly the illusion that Plato is trying to point out in this parable of the cave. The idea that those two things are separate. In the parable of the cave, he's trying to point out that in fact, what we see in the world and what we designate as real life or reality, in some way that has as its condition whatever we notice in the world. It has as its condition in just the same way that the shadows have the actual figures that are casting those shadows as their condition. So everything that we think that we call and designate as real life, all the objects that we're familiar with in the world, all of our experiences, they themselves have as their condition our ideas and our understanding. The only things that we perceive in the world really are the things that we're able to understand. Yeah, what we don't understand, we don't see it either. It's just it's not an object of our perception. And so I hope that at least just introducing this thought and in the context of Plato's parable of the cave, I hope Plato's parable of the cave can sort of give a maybe to use this metaphor again, it can provide us a soil that a proposition like the one that I just gave can sort of establish itself and take root, and we can at least consider it and see where it might lead us. And that's probably a good place to stop. And so I will end this lecture now, and best wishes to everyone. Best wishes to everyone until next time.